Well, I think, first, when one looks back, of all the presidencies I looked at, it seemed to me this was the most coherent foreign policy team. They were sort of working together. They were more or less like-minded of what they were trying to achieve. And was probably the pinnacle of American prestige in the region after the defeat of Iraq in the first Gulf War, after after they'd occupied Kuwait and the United States had pushed them out. Now, there are a lot of flaws of the elder Bush administration, but that achievement in itself, and whatever one thinks now about not getting rid of Saddam Hussein at the time, when they had the chance, at the time this was considered to be responsible and restrained and very statesmanlike on Bush's part. And it left him with enormous prestige. Now, I think he saw that this was the time to try to move forward the Arab-Israeli conflict. And with James Baker, they took a pretty tough line with Shamir, who was then Prime Minister, who was also a Likudnik like Begin, but actually more hard line in some ways even than Begin. And extraordinarily, very stubborn man. And I think they outmaneuvered him to the point where he lost an election and Yitzhak Rabin came in. And I think the poignancy for the Bush administration, that Bush administration, was that they just got to themselves to the point where they were able to build on some foreign policy achievements when the election came, and Bush removing James Baker from being Secretary of State when he was really made himself quite a considerable figure to run his campaign, meant that momentum was lost, and then of course Bush being defeated meant it was lost altogether. But I think you can see in 91, 92 real American political muscle in the region, and the framework being set for taking issues forward into the coming decade. Also, which had the great advantage of the Soviet Union with just evaporating and withdrawing from the scene, so that the old bulwark of the radicals, which was support from Moscow, was suddenly nowhere to be found, and they felt incredibly vulnerable as a result of that. I think the Intifada was a moment of truth for Israeli politics, in that they suddenly realized that they couldn't, instead of having Arafat, it was sort of an old style Nasserite, radical, secular. People had remembered him, with a gun in one hand, always walked around in battle fatigues and so on. And the terrorism of the 80s. All the associations of the Palestinians in the 80s have been pretty negative. It was associated with terrorism, with uncompromising attitudes towards Israel. It was unyielding. And if the Israelis looked tough in response, it was, the Palestinians asked for it. Then all of a sudden you have, from within the territories, kids throwing stones, having demonstrations, and the Israelis really beating down on them, and causing enormous tensions within Israeli society itself. And Israelis having real doubts as to where they were going and what they were doing, and could they sustain that, and so on. So I think the first test was for Israel itself, and I think it was out of that so someone like Rabin is a very good example, realized that they couldn't go on like that. I think the American administration, as was often the case, I think, with Bush, it started under Reagan, picked it up. They saw what was going on. But then, of course, the effects were to some extent countered because the Palestinians handled the Gulf War itself so badly. Arafat supported Saddam, became almost the sort of courtier of Saddam, based himself in Baghdad. And that lost the Palestinians not only ground with the Americans, but with the rest of the Arab world. And then you have the extraordinary exodus of Jews from the collapsing Soviet Union, which reinforced Israel on its demographics. So I think the effects of the Intifada were probably recognised more within Israel and had a shift in Israeli opinion, perhaps more than they did for the Americans, who got moved on and distracted to other things. There's two separate issues with the end of the war itself. There was never an intention to go to Baghdad, for all the reasons that we now understand, that if you did that they would be responsible for it, and they didn't want to be responsible, and they were worried it would break up and that the Iranians would benefit, and so on and so forth. So that there were clear reasons why they didn't want to go to Baghdad themselves. But they did want to see the end of Saddam Hussein, and they thought he would go. And that leads to the second issue, which is actually how you finished the war. The thing about the Gulf War in '91 was that it ended very quickly. And it ended because the Americans had a rather an elaborate plan to beat a quite tough enemy, which involved encircling them and cutting off the Republican Guard and so on, so that Saddam would lose the bulwark of his regime. But instead of that, almost as soon as the Marines moved forward towards Kuwait City, which was supposed to be just a probing thing, the Iraqi resistance crumbled. So the whole choreography of the war went wrong. It was too easy in a sense. So while the U.S. Army was sort of trundling round in this great encirclement movement, the Iraqis were charging home. And when the Americans attacked the retreating Iraqis, it looked like they were setting up for sort of a bloodbath. It's sort of turkey shoot, it was called. And the consequence of that was that the war ended very abruptly. And that that allowed Saddam to say, look, it's the Americans who've called the ceasefire, not us. And the Americans realized that the enormous strength that they were facing from the Republican Guards. So he didn't have to accept it as a defeat, though it clearly was. But he got a lot of his people back. That was a problem. Secondly, instead of, what the Americans hoped was that there'd be a coup, that there'd be some general would say, you've led us into disaster. This is how you've kept power. This is how you're going to lose power, and shot him. They thought something like that would happen, but instead there was an insurrection in the Shiite areas and the Kurdish areas, and the Americans didn't even give a hint that they would support this. They stood back, and when that happened, Saddam used that to crush the insurrection. That had two consequences. First, it made the Sunnis saw him as their protector. It strengthened the regime at its hour of greatest need because he was the one who was able to sustain the Sunni position. Secondly, it created a sense of American responsibility for the Kurds and to a lesser extent the Shiites. So that's where you got the no-fly zones from and so on. So that although the Americans had made a strategic decision not to get involved in Iraqi internal affairs, there they were, involved in Iraqi internal affairs, responsible for the northern Iraq in many ways. And they could never extricate themselves from that, and obviously haven't to this day. So I think all wars tend to end in unexpected and messy ways. And there is, unfortunately, a history of never quite preparing for their aftermath. I don't think that the lack of preparation for the aftermath of this one was anything like the lack of preparation for the aftermath of the more recent one. But it meant that the Americans were caught in ways they didn't expect to be caught.